Oh, hi there. Ollie Anderson here. You're listening to Creative Status. This is a podcast, as you are well aware, where we talk about the human condition, how we can grow real. We try and uncover some of the universal laws that apply to all of us so that we can become aware of those laws, accept them, and then take action with them. That might sound a bit kind of heavy hitting, but it's not really. It's very simple. It's about breaking life down to the building blocks so we can live a real life. Real life means that we're not holding back, we're not hesitating, we're not locked in our own minds because of social conditioning and self-hypnosis and all these kind of things that we talk about. Traditionally, this podcast has been an interview series, but I've decided that every other episode, at least, is now going to be a solo episode. This is really just so I can kind of bring in these building blocks I'm talking about in a lot more detail. Understanding this stuff has changed my life. It's allowed me to keep flowing. It's allowed me to keep growing. There's less fear, less hesitation. I'm more confident. Maybe it's just a consequence of getting older, but it basically all comes down to seeing that we always have a choice. And that choice is always between either fragmentation, which is just the same old bullshit, or moving towards wholeness, which just means letting go of all that stuff and embracing life on its own terms, trusting ourselves and trusting life to get us where we need to be. This solo episode is the second one, and it follows on from the last solo episode, which was about awareness. The thing about this podcast is it's built around the philosophy of realness, which is from my books, if you don't know. If you are new to the podcast, by the way, welcome. My name is Ollie Anderson. I'm a transformational coach and an author. My main book about all this stuff is called Personal Revolutions, A Short Course in Realness. Another book about this is called Shadow Life, Freedom from Bullshit in an Unreal World. In my coaching practice, I walk people through a process of awareness, acceptance, and action. That is something that has changed my life, like I keep saying. And I want to help people to understand this, whether they get coaching from me or not, because it's applicable to all of us. So anyway, the last solo episode of the podcast was about the awareness stuff, basically exploring how the ego is the opposite of reality. And the first step in any transformational journey is learning to identify how our identity is holding us back from the life that we want to be living. The opposite of ego is reality. And so awareness basically is just about starting to shine light on where we are holding ourselves back. This episode is about the next step in the process, which is awareness. And then the next solo episode is going to be about action. Then all the solo episodes after that are just going to be about related topics. But anyway, when it comes to awareness, we need to understand how else you can look at this process of awareness, acceptance, and action. Awareness can also be described as deconstructing the ego. That's going to be really important to understanding some of the things that we're going to talk about in this episode. The next step, acceptance, can also be described as integrating the shadow self. We're going to get into that in more detail, but the abridged version is that the shadow self is all of the very real parts of ourselves that we end up disowning and hiding in what I call the shadow territory because of our attachment to the ego. If you were listening to the last episode, we spoke a little bit about shame and that kind of thing. Ultimately, what happens is we get shamed in childhood, and so the things that we get shamed around, we end up disowning. When we do that, we create this false version of ourselves, this unreal version of who we actually are, the ego, and the consequence of that is that we have all kinds of parts of ourselves sent into exile, as they like to say, in some systems of psychotherapy. Internal family systems is what I'm thinking of. But anyway, those parts get sent into hiding, and then we are ultimately just blocking our awareness constantly to stop them from re-emerging. So we're going to be talking about that particular element of this process today. The next part is action. Action can also just be described as trusting life, doing your best and accepting the rest. We're going to get into that in the next solo episode, obviously. So acceptance really comes down to a classic phrase that we've all heard before. It is what it is. Ultimately, if you can accept that it is what it is, then you're probably going to live the best possible life that you can live, because you're going to have less internal friction, You're not going to be denying these parts of yourself, these vital, life-enhancing parts of yourself. And you're going to be accepting life on the terms by which it operates and the universal laws, for example, cause and effect, and all of the little red pills that we have to accept in life in order to truly just embrace it, so that you can keep flowing and you can keep moving in the direction that you want to be moving in, instead of having life constantly be pushing you around and telling you where to go, i.e. treating you as an effect instead of a cause. Acceptance ultimately is about having a relationship with the truth. So if you've been listening to my stuff for a while, you'll have heard me say that really all we need to do in life is two things: uncover the truth and then live the truth. Uncovering the truth is ultimately about raising awareness, like we were talking about in the last solo episode. But once you've uncovered the truth and you have become aware of it, if you don't accept it and then do something with it, or at least work in alignment with it, then the awareness that you're raising is not really going to be doing anything for you. Becoming aware of things is good, but to state the obvious, but here on planet Earth, we actually have to do things. And so just awareness in itself is just the starting point. Now, as I've already said, the main thing that keeps people from awareness is the ego. And there are three key takeaways related to that in this episode that I want to leave you with. We're going to talk about them in more detail, but the first one is that we are either living our lives in a shame-driven way or a shame-dissolving way. The second thing is that the shadow is always trying to re-emerge because it's real, and the creative process is a big part of that. This podcast started off as really just talking about creativity, and ultimately the main lesson for all those conversations about creativity was that it's about the unconscious becoming conscious. Our conscious mind and our conscious relationship with ourselves can ultimately be seen as about the order that we're ready to accept, and the ego ultimately is just the various things that make up that ordered relationship. The unconscious is all the chaos and the confusion and the things that we've denied about ourselves, but it's always trying to re-emerge. And you need to understand that, because otherwise you're going to resist the call of the shadow self when it is calling to you. And because it is always calling to you, if you don't accept it, then you're actually just going to be denying life and living in a state of resistance. The third takeaway is that I want you to understand that we think we need the ego, which is why we identify with it. This is actually what causes most of the problems. We're identifying with the thing that is causing the block in our awareness, which stops us going down this path towards acceptance and real action. The ego isn't something that we can kill. Like, I'm not one of those guys who says, kill your ego. You can't kill something that's unreal. And here, as embodied beings, i.e. people in fragmented bodies or creatures in fragmented bodies, we're always going to have some kind of an ego, because the ego is really just an extension of the way that we think. And because our thinking is an extension of the fragmented bodies that we're in and the way that they perceive life, then there is always going to be some kind of an ego. But we can put it in the back seat and we can put our realness in the driving seat. So it's not so much as about killing your ego. It's just about realizing that when you accept your real self, your realness, then you're always going to be in the driving seat of your own life. And the ego is just it's a whisper. It doesn't have to be something that's shouting at you and holding you back. When the ego is shouting at you, instead of just a whisper, you can't hear the signal, which is life calling out to you, both internally and externally. Internally, in the sense of all these very real life-enhancing parts of yourself that have been disowned because of your identification with the ego, but also externally with all the things that are calling for you to kind of grow into yourself, to grow into a deeper relationship with life, to take inspired action, which we'll get into in the next episode of the podcast. And so ultimately, growing real and cultivating acceptance is about, first of all, raising awareness of how the ego shows up, but then learning to basically get it to quieten down so that you can kind of distinguish the signal from the noise. When the ego is shouting at us and we're at the start of these transformational journeys, there's so much noise in our heads. There's all this hamster wheel of the same old thoughts going around and around in our brains. There's fear, there's doubt, there's anxiety, there's inner friction, because like I keep saying, we're identifying with the thing, the ego, that is blocking our awareness. And once the awareness is blocked, then the whole of this process becomes blocked and we can't flow with life, because we're just constantly identifying with the thing that is keeping us from life. So I've said that a whole bunch of times now, but the point is, awareness is the thing that opens your eyes to how the ego is holding you back initially. But once you've noticed it, that's when you have to start moving towards acceptance, which is going to get it to shut up, basically, or to at least whisper instead of shout, so that you can actually listen to yourself and listen to life. Ultimately, this comes down to the first of the 3 takeaways that I want to leave you with from this episode. And that is the idea that we are either shame-driven or shame-dissolving. If we're in this situation where the ego is driving us, then ultimately we have a choice to make. The choice is whether to face all of the underlying emotional stuff that caused the ego to arise in the first place and our attachment to it, or to keep avoiding it and to try it and run away from ourselves. In both of those cases, the starting point is shame, but our approach to how we face that shame and all of the shadow stuff that is down there beneath it is ultimately what is going to dictate the course of our lives and whether or not we end up being real and flowing with life, or whether we just end up stuck in these lives of quiet desperation that people like to talk about and banging our heads against a brick wall. And when I say that people like to talk about, I mean me, because I always throw that quote out like a million times a week. Ultimately, if you don't face the shame that has caused you to attach to the ego in the first place, then it will just keep growing. It will get worse and worse and worse, and you'll become more and more attached to the ego because you'll be more and more terrified to confront all of the things that led you going down that path in the first place. If you can stop and pause and face the shame, then it will dissolve. And there are other things that you can do as well, like taking inspired action that's going to allow you to keep growing more real, and it's going to give you evidence that all of the things the ego is whispering are not true. But either way, you can either be shame-driven or shame-dissolving. Shame-driven means that the shame is driving you because you're not facing it. If you look at the world around you, we live in a very shame-driven culture. People all over the place are just driven by shame, i.e. it's their core motivation for doing anything, trying to outrun something that they can't outrun because it's within them. Social media, people basically trying to compensate for like the hole in their lives with material goods and all this kind of stuff. People in toxic relationships because they're scared to actually face themselves and heal. And so they just get involved in these situations where people are using each other to uphold each other's egos so that the shame can stay exactly where it is and they don't have to face it. Blah, 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 blah. Wherever you look, there is just shame everywhere. Shame-driven behavior, addiction, all these things. People putting other people on a pedestal. Like the list is basically endless. That is all shame-driven behavior. And it is because people are actually trying to run away from their shadows. And so they're putting these things, whatever it is that they're running towards, on a pedestal as a way of avoiding themselves. Shame dissolving is ultimately a different path in the sense that it's about cultivating humility. Humility in this sense just means that we're not perfect, that we are going to make mistakes, that we're not going to look exactly like the people in the magazines or wherever it is, or on the movie screen, or all this different stuff. All of those things are just ideals that we think we need to live up to because of the shame-driven approach to life. Shame dissolving is about stepping away from all that bullshit and saying, right, I am not perfect, but I don't need to be perfect. I am light and dark, and I'm going to embrace it no matter what. And when you do that, you are starting to move towards this philosophy that we talked about earlier on, about it is what it is. Ultimately, it's about having a relationship with yourself where you say, right, it is what it is. I am what I am. That is acceptance, and that is the doorway into dissolving all of this shame. You just get to the point where you step away from the judgments. It's not like about good. It's not about bad. It's about it is what it is. That is acceptance. It's about transcending the duality of judgment and the character that you have created for yourself to try and play, aka the ego, because you were thinking that judgment and the matrix we place between ourselves and life is the truth about life. It's not. Shame driven is when you're playing a character in a dream. Shame dissolving is when you start to wake up from the dream because you realize it is what it is and you are what you are. To shift into shame dissolving mode instead of being shame driven, we ultimately need to understand the dance that takes place between the ego and the shadow. So we talked about this already a little bit, but ultimately the shadow dance, as I like to call it, that's from my book, Shadow Life, is this dance that is constantly unfolding between the ego and the shadow as the shadow self tries to re-emerge and the ego tries to block it from actually doing that. The reason that the ego constantly tries to block the shadow is because the ego wants us to believe that we need order, that we need control, that we need certainty, that we need to fit in, that we need to live up to all of the ideals and expectations and judgments that the original shame that caused us to become split from ourselves in the first place makes us believe is the truth about life when it couldn't be further from the truth. The shadow is constantly trying to call you back home. And the reason that the shadow is constantly trying to call you back home is because, like I keep saying, broken record, sorry, is because it's real. The real you never goes anywhere. You can try and hide from it. You can try and cut off and truncate these little parts of yourself and diminish their size or whatever it is that you do because of the shame, but they're never going to go anywhere because what's real is always real. And so this shadow dance takes a lot of energy. It takes so much energy to cling to the ego when the real you is trying to resurface. And so once you start to become shame dissolving and embracing the fact that it is what it is, you are what you are, the world is what the world is, and life is what life is and works according to certain universal principles like the law of cause and effect and various other natural laws like the law of value. For example, you have to give value to the world to get value back from it. All of that stuff, you have to embrace it so that you have a solid foundation. This is why acceptance is so important. If you don't have that acceptance of yourself, the world, and reality, then really nothing that you do is going to be on a solid foundation. And the reason it won't be on a solid foundation is because you can only get results in one place. You can only get results in reality. And the only way that you can have a good relationship, let's say, with reality is by having a foundation of the truth. And then, so again, it comes back to what I said earlier. The first thing you need to do is uncover the truth, but then you need to live the truth. Uncovering the truth is just raising awareness, but then living the truth is accepting it and then building with it. If your shadow is constantly blocked from view, then ultimately you're not going to be building on a solid foundation. You're not going to be building on a rock. You're going to be building on a castle in the sky, because everything that you're doing is just going to be built on top of the ego. And because the ego is unreal, that means all of the actions that you take are unreal. All of the goals that you have for yourself are just an extension of this inner split and the fragmented relationship that you have with yourself. And you may get somewhere, but you're always going to feel that itch. You're going to feel the call of the void. And that call of the void is just your real self, the shadow, calling to you from beneath the surface for you to start dissolving that shame so that you can actually bring your real life to the surface, your shadow life to the surface, and feel like you're actually doing something that you want to be doing with your time here on planet Earth. So all of this brings us on to the third takeaway, which basically sums up all these points. And it's the idea that we don't need the ego. We think we need it, which is why we identify with it so strongly. And the reason that we think we need it is because it's helped us to survive in the past. Back in the day, whenever it was that we originally got shamed and then we started to internalize the shame, the ego gave us some short-term comfort. It stopped us from feeling those feelings and it helped us to kind of deal with whatever was going on in our external environment. But it was just a short-term defense mechanism. It wasn't the truth about who we actually are. And as life has continued to change around us, and we've kept clinging to that version of ourselves that we created, then we basically put a gap between ourselves and life. When the ego is shouting at us and it's disrupting the signal with all of the noise that it causes us to kind of carry in our relationship with ourselves, then it causes all kinds of problems. And it causes problems for all of the reasons I've already said. It blocks awareness. It means that anything that we're doing has been filtered through the ego. So there's a kind of gap between us and reality at all times. And we just end up adding all kinds of complexity and complicated extra steps to our lives. We hold back, we hesitate, we try and maintain the image of the ego no matter what. And that ultimately blocks us from taking the real action that we should be taking in order to keep dissolving that shame and to allow the shadow to come up to the surface so we can become as integrated as possible and live a real life. One thing that we can do is learn to distinguish when the ego is kind of chattering away in our brains versus when the real version of who we are is chattering away. What I like to call this is the gremlin. This is something that's really helped like my coaching clients. Just learning to see when the gremlin is talking to you, i.e. the ego, rather than your real self. The reason that we can call it a gremlin and not who we really are is for all the reasons already mentioned. It's completely unreal, and it's just basically a broken record that we are playing over and over and over again in our brains because of our fear of facing that shame. Ultimately, when we're in that fearful state, we end up splitting from ourselves and we create this kind of false voice within our experience of ourselves that tells us to do things that we don't want to do or tells us to protect things that don't need protecting. The ego or the gremlin always just ends up distorting our relationship with the truth and causing us to resist the truth. And that simply blocks the flow of the shadow self re-emerging to our conscious awareness so that we can actually direct it into the actions that we take. So the next solo episode is going to focus on the action stuff, but ultimately it all comes down to just unblocking the natural flow of the unconscious becoming conscious. There are so many different ways we can do it. Creativity is one of the most common ones that I've talked about, but we can do yoga, we can journal, we can just actually pause and do nothing and try to close our minds down a little bit, the hamster wheel in our minds, so that we can actually listen to that real inner voice. If you want some practical steps for kind of implementing all this stuff that I've been talking about, I just want to ask you a simple question. The shadow self is always trying to emerge, like literally always. It's always calling to you. And if you pause and really think about your life right now, there will be some kind of qualities that are trying to emerge from within you, but they keep getting blocked by those old ego patterns or that old emotional stuff. If you can figure out what those qualities are, and it could, for example, be your confidence, it could be your strength, it could be your love, it could be your joy, it could be your anger, it could literally be anything. But if you can figure out what is trying to emerge, then you're actually going to facilitate this process that is naturally trying to unfold anyway. You're going to actually consciously start to direct it and rewire yourself or reconfigure your unconscious relationship with yourself. So it's a simple question, but what qualities are trying to emerge that you keep blocking? If you can stop blocking them and then find a way to actually act on this, you're going to allow it to come through, to shine through, and life is going to get a lot more real. So that was a pretty simple, let's say, hopefully, exploration of this idea of acceptance. There were 3 key takeaways. The first one is that you're either shame-driven or shame-dissolving. Shame-dissolving means that you're facing whatever is going on inside of you, and it will dissolve. You can speed up the process by taking real action, which we'll get into in the next solo episode. The shadow self is always trying to emerge, always, 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 and it's real. That's the second takeaway that I want you to take from this episode. And then the third thing is that you think you need the ego to protect you, but actually that is not true because it's protecting you from yourself. And if you accept yourself, well, that involves embracing the shadow. And why would you need protecting from your real self? If you want to go deeper into exploring any of this stuff, then you can book a call with me on my website. Just go to Ollie Anderson, that's OLI Anderson.co.uk/talk. I also have a free course, a free 7-day course with a 158-page workbook that walks you through this whole process, awareness, acceptance, and action. It's called The Personality Transplant, System Shock for Realness and Life Purpose. Very dramatic title, but it'll take you quite deep into this and it will help you to start moving in a real way and unblocking yourself. So you can access that at ollieanderson.co.uk/system shock. But yeah, I hope this helps you. I'll see you in the next episode and we'll go deeper into action in the next solo episodes. So stay real out there. Thanks a bunch and peace to you.